All right, I'm going to continue working on elements of pre-algebra that can help you with what we're doing in Algebra 2. And so I'm going to start with an equation like this that deals with all sorts of neat algebraic topics, but mostly about the order of operations. So there are a few things going on with algebra, and then we're going to learn about the order of operations. In the first two videos that we had with fractions, I was giving the instruction evaluate. And I'm still giving the instruction evaluate. However, we're going to evaluate this expression if we know some pieces of information, if x is negative 2 and y is 4. And so I have this crazy looking thing, but I know that x is going to be negative 2 and y is going to be negative 4. So that's the first big thing that we have to do for algebra is the whole concept of substituting equivalent values. So the first step that we're going to have to take is substitution, which is the meat of algebra. The meat of algebra is substituting equivalent values. No matter what those values are, if they're equivalent, we can substitute and use them. So everything in this big, crazy expression is going to stay the same except for the equivalent values that I know. X is negative 2 and y is 4. So the 2/3 on the outside stays the same. This crazy looking thing that some of you are scared of stays the same. The parentheses stay the same. The y, however, the y is going to be 4. So I'm going to change that y to a 4. The minus stays the same. The other parentheses, the 2 stays the same. The parentheses stays the same. Everything else stays the same. Then we have this other scary looking thing that's called absolute value. And some people are afraid of that. And then the x that's here is going to change to negative 2, and everything else is going to stay the same. Closing out that absolute value, and then I'm going to close out that big scary bracket. Again, people are afraid of that, not sure why. So there's that, and then we have the plus sign, and then this square root symbol. Then we have 3, but instead of 3 times x, we're going to have 3 times negative 2, and then the plus 22 stays the same. So that whole concept was the substitution piece. Now what we have to do is deal with this whole mess of things, and we have to know some piece of information before we deal with that. We have to know the thing called order of operations. So we have to know the order of operations. Now, this is where stuff gets crazy because it all deals with funky vocabulary that may have been used in the past. So in the past, you may have heard of things like PEMDAS or GEMDAS or whatever the situation might be. We've heard of those things in the past. What we're going to do is just learn some more about that and then work with it. The P stands for parentheses for PEMDAS. The G stands for grouping symbols. Either way, we got to work inside things that group things together. And so we have to understand what grouping symbols are. Grouping symbols could be parentheses. We're familiar with that. They could be what's called brackets. Those are just bigger parentheses. So this thing that people have been afraid of this whole time, they're just bigger parentheses. But for some reason, students look at that and they freak out. They're just bigger parentheses. And you know what's even bigger than brackets? Something called braces. And the students see that, they freak out. Like, oh, what's that? It's just another grouping symbol. We can relax. Now, there are other grouping symbols that are also operators. So there are sometimes you have an operator that can be a grouping symbol. Something like this, right? Those are straight bars. And people look at those like, oh, I don't know what that is. Well, the straight bars is an operator. That's called absolute value. But absolute value, the symbols for it are also grouping symbols. Right? And here's another operator, the square root. Okay, the square root is an operator, but it also is a grouping symbol, and also the giant division bar. Okay, the giant fraction bar is an operator, and it's a grouping symbol as well. So when we're talking about order of operations, we have to work inside our grouping symbols first. Okay, and that's kind of an important thing. The next order, as we're working inside grouping symbols, once we're addressing those, we can talk about exponents. Okay, so something being raised to a power. That's what we deal with next. So we have something inside grouping symbols, all that gets worked out. If that grouping symbol is raised to a power, then we raise it to that power. That's exponents. And then here's where everything else gets hairy. You have like the MD, multiply, then divide. And that's not the case. It's not the case of multiply, then divide. It's the case that division is, like we said in the previous lesson, division is multiplication of the inverse. They're treated the same. Okay, they're treated the same, and we just work from left to right. And you'll see stuff on Facebook that has like goofball, order of operations problems. So I'm always answering questions from 60-year-olds like, yeah, what's Mr. Katz, what's the answer to this? And we have arguments because there's multiplication, division symbols everywhere. And the arguments are settled easy if you just use parentheses. The rule is simple. Without grouping symbols, you work left to right, period. No matter what engineers may tell me on Facebook, because they're all morons, if without grouping symbols, you work left to right. Okay, so if you're going to argue that point, relearn some stuff. And the same thing works with adding and subtracting. Okay, you treat them the same way. Without grouping symbols, you work left to right. If you don't want to work left to right, use grouping symbols. Okay, so that's the order of operations. So you have to have that down before we get into this this crazy looking thing. So what we're going to do first is work inside grouping symbols. Remember the big scary thing? Just a big grouping symbol. Here's the open, here's the close. So we have to work inside the grouping symbol. And inside the grouping symbol, guess what? More grouping symbols. So we're going to just work step by step inside grouping symbols. All right, so inside the first one, we have 4 minus 2, which is 2. And remember, absolute value as an operator is still a grouping symbol, and we work inside of it. And inside the absolute value, negative 2 minus 3, negative 5. Right? Then we have our closed bracket on the outside, and then the exponent up there. And remember, square root in itself is also a grouping symbol. So inside the grouping symbol, and guess what we have to do first? We have to multiply before we add. And so we have negative 6 here, and then plus 22. So step by step, I'm working inside grouping symbols. And as I look at what we have left here, we're still working inside grouping symbols. There's still this big grouping symbol here with stuff to do. But now we're starting to get into operators. So here we have an exponent that we have to deal with, right? All this stuff that's going on. We have 2 to the third power minus the absolute value of negative 5. And so we have to work with our operators now. 2 to the third power is 2 times 2 times 2. And if you call that 6, smack yourself because it's 8. Okay, so 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. Okay, then we have our minus sign is still there. And then we have the operator here of absolute value. And what is the absolute value of negative 5? Of course, it's positive 5. Okay, and everything else is remaining the same. I haven't touched it yet. And then I'm still going to work inside. There's some work left to do inside this grouping symbol. And inside negative 6 plus 22 is 16. Okay, so that's how that's working, step by step. You know what? I still got stuff going on inside grouping symbols. Son of a gun. So I go back to that big group. So I have 2/3 and then times 8 minus 5 is 3. It's starting to get more manageable. Everything else is staying the same. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and use this operator now, the square root of 16. And for the basic stuff in pre-algebra, we'll call the square root of 16 the principal root of 4. Okay, so we have our principal root of 4. Square root of 16 is 4. And now people are also afraid of this fraction, but we're going to get there in a second because we're not done. We can't multiply this yet because this is being raised to a power. Remember, we have to deal with exponents before we multiply. So of course we have 2/3, and then times 3 to the second power is 9. And then we have our plus 4. And now where things are getting so much more manageable. And so people are looking here and they're, I don't know what to do with the fraction. Well, in the previous lesson about multiplying fractions, this becomes easy. It's 2/3 times 9. And we can either cross cancel or we can multiply numerators and multiply denominators. So either way, if you want to view 9 as a fraction, you can call it 9 over 1 if that helps you out. It doesn't matter to me. So you can call it 18 over 3, or you can cross cancel. No matter what you're going to do, this whole thing will shake up to be 6. And then we have 6, and finally plus 4, 10, And that's how we handle these giant, crazy-looking expressions. We use the order of operations. So again, recall, what did we do for this particular problem? We had to substitute our values for x and y. We had to know our order of operations, and then we had to work using those order of operations. So as long as you're careful and you know how to read, you're not afraid of stuff, completely manageable. You can do it.